on. Stock car racing was very instrumental at the Milwaukee Mile, and this is the first race was held in 1948. It was actually non-sanctioned. And I test myself here. The first guy I forgot. But the second guy is Paul Bjork, who went on to win the race. And it was the North's #1 stock car racetrack. The Milwaukee Mile ended up not only being a hub for AAA racing, but later USAC racing. Their whole schedule is based on those 4 races they held at the Milwaukee Mile. It really solidified a series, which, if it would have been managed correctly, could have really gave NASCAR a run for its money. Yes, they ran Edsels. That's an Edsel leading, that's 1960, and leading, I think that's, it's Norm Nelson, and the number is a 60 Ford, a Zautke Lube car. And speaking of Zautke Lube, that was a team started by Bill Traynor. And Zautke Lube is an interesting story. We're in the process of writing a book on USAC stock car racing, Richie Murray, myself, and Pat Sullivan. And doing research on Zautke Lube, which I knew a bit about, was my dad would always mention Miss Vanderhurst. And he always spoke very well of her. So I did kind of a deep dive on her. Very interesting story. Zautke Lube was started in 1933, right in the height of the Depression, by her husband. And what's interesting is her husband and his wife, Miss Vanderhurst, they were literally partners. So she went to all the trade shows, and he was constantly tinkering and looking for, he would seek out people who had a product but didn't know how to market. He would bring it under the Zautke Lube umbrella and market it on their behalf, or buy the rights for it. And that's how he started to expand the company. Unfortunately, he passed away suddenly in 1955 of a heart attack. The vultures start to circle and say, "We'd like to buy your company." She's like, "I ain't selling it." She goes, whatever, I forget his gentleman's name, Herman or whoever. He taught me how to run this company. I'm going to run this company, and she did. For many years, and she ran into Bill Traynor, and he's like, you could really market to an expanding audience, and they first became a sponsor, and then they started a race team. And he was big on bringing in the big names to drive for them. A.J. Foyt drove for him. In fact, Merle, you might not know this. I dug this up. So they held a USAC race in Charlotte in 1961, early in May. And your father went down there, and Bill Traynor was going to sign him. In fact, signed him to a deal to run for Zautke Lube. Unfortunately, May 12th happened, and then he signed, Eddie Sachs took over that ride. So, but all the big names drove for Zautke Lube in the early 60s. And there's the Eddie Sachs car, who would end up to win a couple races at the Milwaukee Mile. And there's A.J. Foyt. And Eddie Sachs was, of course, a crowd favorite, not only for, of course, sprint cars early on, and then raced, of course, Indy cars, but hydroplanes, but also was quite successful running stock cars. Parnelli Jones. Who's that guy? Dr. Bob. So, Parnelli Jones went on absolute butt kicking at the Milwaukee Mile in 1963, 64, and 65, winning 7 consecutive races in stock cars, and then winning races in Lotuses, and just dominated. You can talk to anybody at Milwaukee, talk to an old timer at Milwaukee. Many people go Mario, AJ. There's a lot of people in Milwaukee who say Parnelli Jones. My dad was one of them. My dad said Parnelli Jones was the best pure race car driver he ever saw. He'd say Bobby Unser was the fastest, but Parnelli was the guy who was best overall, in his opinion. And this is an interesting shot. This is before the race. And if you notice, USAC did some strange things in stock cars. If you notice, the doors are supposed to be welded shut. Yeah. And I see a violation right on the starting grid. It's like, what is going on? That's Ted Haynes' car with the door open, like a Trans Am car. That's Gordon Gorman, by the way, in front. Norm Nelson was an icon at the Milwaukee Mile. In fact, started to run midgets just prior to the war, and then ended up, he was a big guy too. He was like 6'2", 3", and migrated to stock car racing and ran stock cars from pretty much from 1948 until 1974. And it was based in Racine, Wisconsin. Had Norm Nelson Automotive. Also had a very successful snowmobile winter sports business on the side. And had a bunch of drivers racing for him, of course. Jim Hurtubise raced for him, Lloyd Ruby. In fact, Lloyd Ruby, when he raced for Norm Nelson in 64, that was because Hurtubise was hurt. And he had Roger McCluskey winning multiple stock car championships for him. There's a plethora of hot drivers. This is what a lot of people consider this was actually the first corporate race sponsorship. Nowadays, it's not unusual for races. You know, back in the day, the Schaefer 500 and races like that. But the Miller 200 in 1968 is kind of considered the first time a corporation approached the track and said, you know, we'd like to be involved. And they didn't want to necessarily wanted to single out a driver. They didn't want to show favoritism. And it was brought up, why don't you sponsor the race? And what that did was it pumped in a lot of money into the race and became one of the most highly, one of the biggest prizes, well, the biggest prize on the USAC Stock Car stage. And it brought out a whole bunch of drivers, and it was kind of the center race for the stock car schedule. One of the winners was Bobby Unser in 1969. And if you ran that race, in order to get the contingency money, you had to run a Miller High Life sticker on your car. And that's a shot. That's Larry Berwanger hitting the wall. And that's my dad on the right. And Armin Krieger, some of you guys may know who race photographer Armin Krieger was. That's him on the left. And the winged cars. So you got a Dodge Daytona and a Plymouth Superbird, Don White, Roger McCluskey. The Milwaukee Mile held more winged stock car races than any other. More than Daytona, more than Talladega. They held 12 times winged cars raced at the Milwaukee Mile. And they were quite successful. A lot of Bobby Unser broke the track record. Don White, Roger McCluskey, but other guys like Sal Tavella, Ramos Stott did well in those. And there is the track record holder in 1972. That record held for 3 years. That's, of course, Bobby Unser in the Ray Nichols Superbird. A.J. Foyt has had some bad accidents. We know Road America, 1990. We know Michigan, 1981. Of course, Riverside in 65. This might be his fourth or fifth hardest hit. This is 1971, and that's him and Jack Bauscher's Torino. Bade Arnella's transmission locked up on him on the front straightaway. AJ went around this car. That's Lou Burmeister, who also was a midget driver. That's him in the 24 car. And he hit, go to the next one. He hit Bay a ton. And he was knocked out. And he was in the car for a long time. They got him out of the car, and he took 2 weeks off after this wreck. A very, very hard wreck. And there is Bobby Unser and Jack Bauscher. Jack Bauscher holds the record for stock car poles at the Milwaukee Mile with, I think, 14 poles. And it's Dave Watson. Dave Watson kind of came out of nowhere. He was a short track driver to win a bunch of races at Milwaukee and on the USAC Stock Car Trail in 1977-78. What's interesting, that car started off as a 72 Nova. Had no success. They tore the car down, rebuilt it, put on a Buick Skylark body, and it was one like a scalded dog. In 1978, ASA came to Milwaukee for the first time. The USAC Stock Car Series was kind of floundering a bit. ASA came, and that was the young series and had a lot of good drivers. Here's Bob Sineker from Dorr, Michigan. He was one of the hot shots. He had drivers like Dick Trickle raced in it, and he hit the next one. There's Dick Trickle, one of the most popular drivers out there, over 1,000 short track wins. And they knew how to promote. Here's a promotional shot at Milwaukee with Dick Trickle and Alan Kwiecki from about 1985. And then NASCAR came in 1984 and 1985 in the old late model series, and then came back in 1993. Dale Earnhardt, old Dale raced at the Milwaukee Mile too. That's an ASA race, and I think in '88. At the Indy Car racing, of course, we had the Parnelli Jones super team in the early 70s, and there's Mark Donahue. After Mark won in 1972 in a race in which Gary Bettenhausen should have won, the following race in Milwaukee, Rex Mays never raced at Milwaukee, finished second. This is 1971. We got Bobby Unser in Jim Malloy's car that he ran at Indianapolis. That's why it looks a little different. It's all the dark navy blue. We got Joe Leonard and AJ, Lloyd Ruby, Billy Vukovic, Mario in that McNamara car, and kind of hard to see that. I think that's Mike Mosley, Al Unser, Gary Bettenhausen, Rutherford. I think that might be Krisloff and the rest of the field. Johnny Rutherford was a driver that did the double, won Indianapolis 500 and also won the Rex Mays Classic the following week. And there he is passing Roger McCluskey and Lindsey Hopkins. And there's Johnny in victory lane with Jack Baker. Jack Baker was a local DJ, track announcer there for about 20 years, and had the largest album collection in the Midwest. Big band, huge big band and jazz guy. Mike Mosley. Mike Mosley won 3 races at the Milwaukee Mile, 2 of them for Jerry O'Connell. And this is, talked to Donald Davidson a couple of years ago, we were chatting, and this is a bit of trivia that we won. So this is a 1975, Tony Bettenhausen 200. He won the race. I'm done, retires. Next race is Michigan. Bobby Unser gets in the car because Dan Gurney was having some financial issues, and they took the rest of the year off in '75. So Bobby Unser gets in the car, and running second, I believe, lost the tire in the last lap, hit the wall, broke his leg. Oh boy. Next race is Trenton. Well, Bobby goes, why don't you check on my brother Al's? Because they were having issues because Firestone was pulling out of racing and whatnot. And Al goes, I'll drive the car at Trenton. So he drives the car at Trenton, finishes third. Fantastic. Or second or third. They're all top 4 finishes. And then Parnelli Jones calls and said, hey, I need you for Phoenix. We're going to come back with this Cosworth. And they had a program for 76 set up. So they wanted to start it at the last race in Phoenix. And then Al goes, talk to Mario. Judd Phillips is like, I don't know, Mario goes, yeah, I'll drive it. One goes out and finishes 4th. Judd was all kind of like, oh man, sorry. He says, no, I had a blast out there. The car worked great. I just did a few things on the track. Maybe could have picked up a couple positions, but I had a blast. So you had Mike Mosley, Bobby Unser, Al Unser, and Mario Andretti drove that car for the last 4 races of the year. Over the season, Mike Mosley goes, I'm going to come back. He goes out and wins the next race at Milwaukee. In '81, he won the race in the Pepsi Challenger in the Chevy powered. That's the car he puts on the front row at Indy. They have early motor issues. Go to Milwaukee, practice. Motor issues again. They put him in as promoter's option. Runs like a scalded dog, wins the race. And of course, the Andretti's sweeping the podium in 1991. You got Michael Andretti, John Andretti. Mario finished 3rd. He ain't happy. He is pissed. Of course, Nigel Mania. And my buddy Dave will agree with me. People were talking about Fernando Alonso. Oh, this is so big, Fernando Alonso, for all this. And it was good that he came in. A lot of media. Wasn't anything like this guy. When he came to kart in 1993, it was incredible how much media he brought with him. Not only from England, but from the European. I mean, it was huge. And it electrified the series. And then on top of that, he goes out to Milwaukee. Wins the race, first time out. That was a driver. Penske Domination, this is 2 laps short. They red flagged the race in the rain. Al Unser Jr., Paul Racing, MO. This is a trick photo. So, 1979 Rex Mays, they had a little 25 lap, kind of like a special race. They were checking to see if they could run the USAC Championship cars, which dirt championship cars. I hate the term Silver Crown, but that's my editorial. They're champ cars, and they ran them at Milwaukee in a 25 lap race, which was won by, I think, George Schneider. There's Eric Gordon, and they did actually bring him back many years later, but Eric Gordon won a race, and hopefully we'll get him back, I think, next year. Silver Crown might be back. Rick Mears, Rocket Rick Mears, winning a race, and the guy next to him, Bill Mears. If you ever met his parents, they were salt of the earth people. The Mearses, they were just fantastic. One of my favorite people. He always they ran a little trailer, sold souvenirs, and they were genuinely nice people.
Mears gang.
The Mears gang, yep. Of course, there's Carl Haas and Paul Newman. Of course, the big auction this weekend with the Carl Haas cars going out. And Scott Dixon winning. I put this in here because it actually shows one a few times. Me working at the Milwaukee Mile, that's me on the left giving stats to the PA guy in Victory Lane. This is 1998. I talked about Rex Mays. They had put a plaque in dedicated to Rex Mays a few years after the incident happened. It was stolen in the early 60s. They recovered it years later, but they never put it back out there. So we thought, you know what, why don't we rededicate it and put it in the turn 2. So that's Ted Lake. Some of the old USAC old-timers may remember Ted Lake. He was a chief observer in USAC for many years. That's him on the left. That's Al Krause, my mentor, on the right. And that's Dave Eline, who started the Harry Miller meet and his Miller Special. And we're going to transition to the Harry Miller meet, which is, in my opinion, the greatest oval-based meet, vintage IndyCar race meet that's out there. And that's Emil Andrews on the left in the front there with Chuck Davis, Griff Ferguson, and Bob Sutherland, along with Dave Eline started the organization in 1995. And that's some shots that we do a traditional photo on the front straightaway on Friday morning. Some more shots. Just beautiful. We always make sure we get Harry Miller cars in the front row. And we had AJ one year, so we piggybacked the event with the IRL race or IndyCar race, and that's Daniel Davis with AJ Foyt. That's 2015. And that's we had Dario Franchitti in the car, and that's AJ and Robin giving them pointers. And we had Johnny Rutherford come out, and it's interesting. They said, "What's your favorite Harry Miller car?" And he said the Louis Meyer car from '27, which is also my favorite Miller car. So the Speedway Museum was gracious enough to bring it out. Who is that guy? There's our Dr. Dix and the Parnelli car during the ARCA. I think that's during the ARCA event we had 2 years ago. And vintage racing continues at the Milwaukee Mile. And racing returns. We got NASCAR coming back to Milwaukee next year as part of their playoffs. I think it's a big deal along with ARCA, taking baby steps back in a very similar plane that they did with Gateway. And hopefully we'll have IndyCar back there in 2024. Thank you. Appreciate it. You want to do Q&A?
Let's pick up the lights over here on this wall on the right. You got time?
Yeah, we can do Q&A if you want.
Q&A.
Yeah.
So, anyway, Steve, thank you. That was most enlightening. You are in the Golden Club of illustrious speakers. You did a wonderful job. Thank you so much. Pictures were tremendous. So why don't we take some questions? So we've got a few minutes, so we still have the room. So Steve, we'll turn it back over to you to take some questions.
Yes, I am married. No kids. 2 beagles. Burrow.
Steve, I don't know if you know, but my dad won his last race.
Yes, he did.
In the State Fair Park, how many individual races, and that was in August of 1960. He also won the stock car race on Thursday, and was leading the Indy Car race in the Miranda round, 13 laps to go.
As AJ would say, that is quite true. And what's interesting is that car was the stock car he's talking about it was a 58 Ford that Jerry Unser had won the USAC Stock Car crown with. And then unfortunately he got killed at Indy. That's another story for another day. But then his widow sold it to Tony, or no, Roger Ward. Roger Ward bought the car and he drove it, and then your dad also drove it. A very, very successful car. Anyone else?
You mentioned a little bit about AAA big cars and like that, a little bit there. But IMCA played a big role there for a time, back in, I don't know, before the war, right, in that time frame?
Yeah, they did, especially right after the war, too.
Yeah.
Because if you look at the AAA records and that, they only hit race, 3-4 times.
Right.
And AAA they also ran at the fairgrounds out here famously in 1946.
Right.
But they also ran, they were kind of hitting the ground a lot quicker and ran a lot. And there was some cooperation until USAC started to do USAC
And
things.
there were several unsanctioned kind of events going back even to the 20s and stuff. I've seen, I mean, you've probably seen them, but I've seen photos of what they called Model T races, where people just from the local area brought their Model Ts out, and they had riding mechanics, two guys in a car, riding around there like a 25-lap race or something like that. And
one thing I did forget to say, in 1915 and they ran 2 24-hour races at Milwaukee, in which they were, at that time, they were the Milwaukee Area Auto Club, which was the dealers. They had an association. They were really pushing the automobile racing to show that the cars could, you could run a car and it's not going to break down on you. Dave?
How many races were run on the road course inside the oval?
Well, that's interesting because when they paved the racetrack in 54, they did the road course too. And then Cliff Tufte made Road America in 1955. But there was always a cooperation between Road America and even Great Lakes Dragway. The three of them had a pact. The 3 major racetracks in Milwaukee never to step on each other. So State Fair Park had a traditional schedule of 6 races, of a June IndyCar race right after Indy, the July Stock Car race, usually the second week in July, State Fair, and then a race in September. Great Lakes Dragway had their 2 big shows on Memorial Day and Labor Day weekend. Those were their 2 big shows. And then you had Road America had usually their 500-mile race, their June sprints. Right. And so there was always nice cooperation. Those early races on the road course were SCCA sanctioned. And Phil Hill, a lot of big names, like Ferraris and whatnot, raced on that. It's a very tight track. And it was...
The oval did they use in conjunction with the...
Pretty much as all of them do. It's backwards. They come into turn 4. It's just like, it was a lot like Indy, except without that little Mickey Mouse thing in turn 1. They'd actually come around turn 1 all the way around.
Yeah, I think. Go ahead,
Gene.
Did they ever run track roadsters there?
Yes, good question. Yes, Andy Granatelli's group came up to in 49 and 50, in which a few of the AAA guys ran, and I don't know how they got away with that. A few of them were just before they were running AAA, but yeah, they ran them. They were very successful too. They had good crowds. Andy was a showman, but they had a little bit of a hippodrome quality to them.
Yeah, you live up there, but I've heard of a lot of activity at that track, like street drags and stuff like that they've had, and that's still going on, isn't it?
The street drags are not, because they couldn't get the insurance. But no, there is always activity. Actually, in the early 2000s, there was a lot of NASCAR testing there. They were testing there almost weekly. because they couldn't race at the cup teams. The rule back then was you couldn't race at a track that had a cup race. And at that time, of course, they didn't have a cup race there, but they had a Grand National or Busch, whatever you call it. So there's a lot of guys tested there because it was like Phoenix. It was like 1 mile flat track. It was like Loudon. There was a lot of stuff they could pick up off the testing.
Something you briefly touched on that got me intrigued is you talked about board track racing.
Yeah.
Was that a wooden track somebody built?
Yeah, board track racing was huge in the 1920s. And, you know, the environmentalists talk about waste. I like to show a board track because it was incredible. They were 2x6s, yeah.
Set on the end.
And they weren't laid flat. They were laid
Right.
up. So, and some of them were like 2 miles long. A track like Michigan, think of that.
Steeper than Daytona.
And they had all the intricate racing underneath. I mean, the board length that was involved in making these. And there was a formula. The guy that had designed it was called John Prince. He had a formula which they would follow, and they were in Altoona, Pennsylvania. They were all over. There's one built in Miami, and they ran one race on in the hurricane came and wiped it out. They reclaimed the wood though, and pretty much built up Miami with that wood. But what's interesting is Ralph Hepburn had the track record in 1929 in a Miller, 141 miles an hour on a board track. The tires this wide. That's balls. That's craziness. A cloth helmet. That's,
And they raced the motorcycles on those things.
yeah.
Yeah, they did.
Yeah, and they would, the constant pounding, they get these knots, and they get holes in them, and the kids would climb up and they'd stick their heads on
Oh.
and look, and it would freak out the drivers. No kidding, right? And then they duck when the cars would.
Oh my gosh.
Yes.
I just wanted to say, I'm sorry about my phone, but I had to answer.
Oh no, it's okay.
My son coming from Utah, he was telling me that he's in against everybody. I'm sorry.
Oh no, that's fine. We don't mind. That's a part of modern living.
Okay.
Oh, I write for Automobilia magazines. Did we hand those out? Yes, hand them out. So feel free to take a magazine. And then I also got I have a couple old IRL press guides if anybody wants them that I brought. So anybody wants that. I know this is the part where we're gonna auction off Bob's
My
boat.
jacket.
Yeah, so we'll start the bidding.
Somebody tried to steal it earlier in the evening, but I got it back so we can auction it.
$1.
I might say that Tony George has Louis Meyer's sweater that he won in, but it also has the splinters from a board track accident, and I have seen the sweater. So you can survive an accident on a board track. And it reminds me, if any of you remember back to the day that they ran motorcycles inside barrels, that's similarly what it was like. Also, the Foyt dirt champ car can be seen in the Bruno's Museum in Jacksonville, Florida. Dan Davis has a world-class, and we have some world-class auto museums, but if you get the chance to get to Jacksonville, his family owns Winn-Dixie. He is a great-great-grandson of the founder of Winn-Dixie, but be sure you stop by, and to me, that's just seeing that car, what it did at Milwaukee, almost winning that race. And if he had had a bigger fuel tank, he had to make one more pit stop, 6 instead of 5, or he'd have won the race. So I'd like to give Steve another hand. Thanks for coming, and we really enjoyed the evening. I'd be remiss